The scar on his face was a map of a life he never spoke of, a jagged line from temple to jaw that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent grim irony. Silas called the plains his home, but the land offered no comfort, only an expanse of emptiness that mirrored his own. It was a world of bleached grass and a sky so vast it could swallow a man's soul without a sound. He rode with the rhythm of the wind, a solitary figure in a landscape that had forgotten the touch of rain. His horse, a sturdy roan named Ghost for the way it moved through the shimmering heat, was the only living thing he spoke to most days, and even then, his words were clipped, worn smooth as river stones. He was tracking a stray from his small herd, a task that had pulled him further east than he cared to go, into territory where the silence felt different, thinner, as if holding its breath. The sun was a hammer beating down on the cracked earth, and the world was painted in shades of brown and scorched yellow. It was then he saw it, a flicker of white against the monochrome canvas, a thing that did not belong. He reined Ghost to a halt, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle in its scabbard, a habit born of long years alone. It wasn't an animal. It was too still, too deliberate in its shape. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle groaning in the quiet, and moved forward, his boots crunching on the brittle ground. The white was the fabric of a dress, impossibly fine for this God-forsaken land, now torn and stained with dirt and something darker. And in the dress was a woman, or a girl, it was hard to tell. She was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there, her dark hair a tangled mess across her back. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her still form. He hesitated for a moment, a stranger to the act of touching another human being, then gently placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. The pulse, faint and thready, like a moth beating against glass, but it was there. He rolled her over carefully. Her face was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and blue. She looked young, her features delicate even in unconsciousness, a stark contrast to the brutal landscape she'd collapsed in. The dress, what was left of it, was silk and lace, the attire of a bride, an orphan bride, running from something terrible enough to send her into the heart of this desolation. He saw the faint bruising on her wrist, the raw look of someone who had fought and fled. A wave of something cold and old, something like anger, washed through him. He had seen the cruelty of men before. The fire that had taken his family had been set by human hands. He looked at the endless horizon, then back at the fragile form at his feet. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her with him was a complication he hadn't sought and did not want, but the choice was not a choice at all. His heart, a thing he'd thought long dead and buried, gave a dull, aching throb. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire sky, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of sharp bones and fragile hope. He carried her back to Ghost, settling her in front of him in the saddle, her head lolling against his chest. Her breath was a faint whisper against his shirt. As he turned his horse back toward the west, toward his isolated homestead, he knew he wasn't just carrying a woman. He was carrying a secret, a story, and a trouble that was sure to follow. The scar on his face seemed to tighten, a familiar reminder that the past is never truly gone. It just finds new ways to hunt you. The journey back was a slow, deliberate procession against the dying light. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, colors that seemed to echo the turmoil he felt inside. The woman in his arms stirred a few times, a soft moan escaping her lips, a sound so full of pain it made the muscles in his jaw clench. He held her steady, his movements sure and practiced, a stark contrast to the unsteadiness in his own soul. For years, his life had been a simple, brutal equation. Work, eat, sleep. The land demanded everything and gave back just enough to survive. He had built his world on a foundation of silence and solitude, a fortress against the memories that haunted his nights. Now, this woman, this fragile piece of another world, had breached his defenses without a word. Her presence was a stone dropped into the still, dark pool of his existence, and the ripples were spreading, touching shores he had long since abandoned. He could feel the fine texture of her hair against his chin, the slight weight of her body against his. It was an intimacy so foreign it felt like a violation, yet there was a part of him, a deeply buried, starved part that leaned into it. He remembered the feel of his wife's head on his shoulder, the weight of his daughter in his arms. The memories were ghosts, rising from their graves, and he pushed them back down with a grim determination. Pain was a familiar country. He had no desire to revisit it. They reached his homestead as the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a barn leaning slightly to the north, and a web of corrals. It was a lonely outpost, a testament to one man's stubborn refusal to be broken by the world. He dismounted carefully, lifting her from the saddle and carrying her toward the cabin. The door opened with a familiar creak. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but it was better than the hard-packed earth. He lit a lantern, the golden light pushing back the shadows, and for the first time, he could see her clearly. The grime and dust couldn't completely hide the delicacy of her features. High cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that even in its current state seemed made for smiling. Her hands were soft, uncalloused, the hands of a lady, not a pioneer. The wedding dress was a tragedy. Its fine silk ripped, its lace collar stained with blood from a small cut on her temple. What kind of monster would drive a bride to this? He pushed the thought away. It was not his business. His only business was to keep her alive. He moved to the small hearth, stoking the embers of the morning's fire and adding a few pieces of wood. He filled a kettle with water from the bucket and set it on to heat. His movements were economical, wasting no energy. He was a man who knew how to conserve everything, his food, his strength, his emotions. He found a clean rag and a basin, pouring some of the warm water into it. He returned to the cot and hesitated again. He needed to clean the cut on her head, to wash the dirt from her face. It felt like trespass, but he was a practical man. Infection in this land was as deadly as a bullet. He dipped the rag in the warm water, wrung it out, and gently began to dab at her forehead. She flinched in her sleep, a small, frightened sound escaping her throat. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I mean you no harm." The words felt strange in the quiet cabin, loud and clumsy. He continued his work, cleaning the cut, washing the grime from her cheeks and neck. Her skin was soft beneath the cloth, a startling contrast to his own calloused, scarred hands. When he was done, he pulled a rough wool blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders. She seemed to sink into the warmth, her breathing evening out slightly. He stood and looked down at her for a long moment, this beautiful, broken thing that had washed up on the shores of his lonely life. He didn't know her name, where she came from, or what horrors she was fleeing. He only knew that for tonight, she was safe. He took another blanket for himself and settled into the hard-backed chair by the dying fire, his rifle resting across his knees. He did not sleep. He watched over her, a silent guardian in the vast, unforgiving darkness, and listened to the sound of her breathing, a fragile rhythm that had irrevocably changed the silence of his home. Dawn broke cold and gray, the light seeping into the cabin like a slow tide. The woman was still asleep, her face turned toward the wall. Silas was already up, having tended to his animals in the pre-dawn chill. He moved around the small space with a quiet that was second nature, stoking the fire, putting on a pot of coffee. The aroma filled the cabin, rich and earthy. He glanced at the cot. She hadn't moved. He knew she needed rest more than anything, but she would also need water and food when she woke. He made a thin gruel of oats, a staple of his diet, and set it on the hearth to keep warm. He then sat at his small, rough-hewn table, sipping his coffee and sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar, comforting sound. An hour later, she stirred. A soft sigh, then a sharp intake of breath as awareness returned. He saw her body tense under the blanket. He stopped the motion of his knife, the silence in the cabin suddenly heavy and fraught. He watched as she slowly, cautiously pushed herself up, her eyes wide and panicked as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. They were the color of a forest floor, deep brown and full of shadows. When her gaze landed on him, on the scarred side of his face illuminated by the morning light, a flicker of fear crossed her features. He didn't blame her. Children ran from the sight of him. He remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, wanting to show her he was not a threat. He just looked at her, his own expression unreadable, a mask he had perfected over years. She clutched the blanket to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white. Her gaze darted around the cabin, from the rifle leaning against the wall to the closed door, cataloging threats, calculating her chances. He could see the terror in her, but underneath it there was a flicker of something else, a stubborn resilience. She was a survivor. He had seen that look in the eyes of cornered animals, the ones that would fight to the death rather than surrender. Good. I'd like to see that. Robert's touching surrender already? Passing travel bristled. She raised her chin. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. You're safe here, he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured with his chin toward the hearth. There's food, when you're ready. He didn't press her. He didn't ask her name or her story. He simply stated a fact and offered a comfort. He understood that questions were a form of pressure, and she was too brittle to bear any pressure right now. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He picked up his hat and his rifle. I have chores, he said, his voice directed at the floor. No one will bother you. He walked to the door and paused, his back to her. The water in the bucket is fresh. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin. Outside, the air was sharp in his lungs. He leaned against the rough log wall, closing his eyes for a moment. Her fear had been a palpable thing, a scent in the air. He was used to being alone, but he was not used to being the cause of such terror. It left a sour taste in his mouth. He went about his work, mending a broken fence post, his movements mechanical. But his mind was not on the task. It was in the cabin, with the silent, frightened woman. He had brought her into his world, and now he was responsible for her. It was a weight he hadn't realized he was picking up when he'd lifted her from the dust. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, a pale disk in a sea of gray clouds. He finished his meal, washed his bowl, and then turned to face her. I have to ride out, he said. Check some traps. I'll be back before nightfall. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes were still wide, still wary, but the raw panic had subsided, replaced by a watchful stillness. He saw a small leather-bound book on the floor beside the cot, something that must have been in a pocket of her dress. It was a book of poetry, a small, incongruous piece of a gentler world. You can bolt the door from the inside, he added, his voice softer than he intended, if it would make you feel better. He left without waiting for a reply. As he saddled Ghost, he felt a strange sense of unease. He was leaving a woman, a stranger, alone in his home. It was a risk, but it was also a test of trust. He was offering her a small piece of it, hoping she might offer a piece back. As he rode away, he glanced back at the cabin. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. She had added wood to the fire. It was a small thing, but in the vast, silent language of the plains, it felt like a word. It felt like the beginning of an answer. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements hushed so as not to disturb the sleeping woman on his cot. He would leave food warming on the hearth and a fresh bucket of water by the door before heading out to tend to his land. He slept in the chair, a position he was accustomed to from long nights on the trail, though the nearness of another person made his sleep light and restless. The woman, whom he still didn't have a name for, began to inhabit the small cabin in subtle ways. He would return at midday to find the floor swept or his few tin plates and cups washed and stacked neatly. She never spoke. She never met his gaze for more than a fleeting second. Most of the time she sat on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, her hands clasped in her lap, a statue of silent fear. But he noticed small changes. The terror in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a deep, weary sadness. Her movements became less furtive. One afternoon he returned to find she had mended the tear in his work shirt, her stitches small and even, a testament to a skill learned in a different life. He said nothing, but he felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. He found a spare set of his deceased wife's clothes packed away in a wooden chest, a simple wool skirt and a homespun blouse. They were plain and worn, but clean and sturdy. He left them folded at the foot of the cot while she was outside, a brief, necessary trip to the outhouse. When he came back later, she was wearing them. The clothes were too big for her thin frame, but they seemed to give her a small measure of dignity, a way to shed the identity of the broken bride and the ruined dress. She had washed her hair, and it hung down her back, dark and wavy. She looked less like a ghost and more like a person. That evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, she moved from the cot to the chair opposite him. It was the closest she had voluntarily come to him. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating the hollows of her cheeks. She was still painfully thin, but some color had returned to her skin. He continued his work, not wanting to spook her with a direct look or a sudden movement. He could feel her gaze on his scarred face. He was used to people staring, but her look was different. It wasn't revulsion or morbid curiosity. It was just observation, a quiet, steady appraisal. "There was a fire," he said, his voice low, not looking up from his task. The words came out of their own accord, breaking the comfortable silence. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe to give a name to the thing she was looking at. Maybe because the silence between them was starting to feel heavy with things unsaid. She didn't respond, but he felt the quality of her attention shift, becoming more focused. "Took my wife, my daughter." He set the rifle aside, his hands suddenly feeling empty and useless. He looked into the flames, the memories flickering there like ghosts. "I was the only one who made it out." He finally turned to look at her. Her eyes were filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to understanding, a shared knowledge of loss. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in that shared look a bridge was built across the chasm of their silence. A fragile, tentative span. She unfolded her hands from her lap. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached into the pocket of the skirt and pulled out a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. She held it in the palm of her hand, offering it to him without a word. He leaned forward, looking at the object. It was finely made, with intricate engravings of vines and leaves. Her fingers, trembling slightly, opened the clasp. Inside were two miniature portraits. One was of an older woman with a kind face. The other was of a handsome, cruel-looking man. She pointed to the woman, then to herself. "Mother." Then she pointed to the man, and a look of such profound fear and loathing crossed her face that it made Silas's gut clench. She closed the locket with a sharp snap and drew her hand back, clutching it to her chest as if to ward off an evil spirit. He understood. The man in the locket was what she was running from. Her husband, the source of the bruises, the terror, the flight into the desolate plains. Her silence was not just a choice, it was a shield. That night, she did not retreat to the cot immediately. She remained in the chair, watching the fire die down, a silent companion in the darkness. When he finally banked the embers for the night, he looked over at her. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted to one side. She had fallen asleep in the chair. He stood and gently lifted her, just as he had done that first day. She was still impossibly light. He carried her to the cot and laid her down, pulling the blanket over her. As he did, her lips parted and a single word escaped. A soft, broken whisper. Ilara. Her name. It hung in the air, a fragile gift. Silas stood over her for a long time, the name echoing in the quiet of his heart. Ilara. He finally had a name for the woman who had upended his world, and in that name he felt a new, more dangerous kind of responsibility. It was one thing to care for a nameless stranger, it was another thing entirely to care for Ilara. The speaking of her name, Ilara, was like a key turning in a long rusted lock. It did not open the floodgates of conversation, but it changed the quality of the silence that bound them. It was no longer a silence of fear and uncertainty, but one of slow, budding familiarity. He began to call her by her name, his rough voice softening around the syllables, and each time he said it, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition that she was seen as a person, not just a survivor. She, in turn, began to emerge from her shell. She started to take on more tasks around the cabin, moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a well-bred upbringing now adapted to a harsher reality. She learned the rhythm of his life, anticipating his needs. She would have a hot cup of coffee ready for him when he came in from the pre-dawn cold, and she learned to bake a passable, if dense, bread on the hearth. Silas found himself watching her, intrigued by the contrast between her delicate appearance and her surprising resilience. He saw the way she moved with a quiet grace that even the ill-fitting clothes couldn't hide. He saw the intelligence in her eyes as she read the book of poetry by the firelight, her lips sometimes moving silently, tasting the words. He began to leave small things for her, a handful of wild berries he found on the trail, a single eagle feather he discovered near the creek. They were silent offerings, acknowledgments of her presence, and she would accept them with a small, shy inclination of her head, a gesture that was more eloquent than 1,000 words of thanks. One evening he was mending a leather strap, his hands deft and sure. The awl slipped and the sharp point dug deep into the fleshy part of his palm. He swore under his breath, a low, guttural sound, and pulled his hand back, watching his blood welled up from the wound. Before he could even move to get a rag, Elara was at his side. She took his hand in hers, her touch surprisingly firm. Her brow was furrowed with concern as she examined the cut. She moved to the hearth, dipped a clean cloth in the warm water, and returned to gently clean the wound. Her proximity was startling. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair, feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. His heart, a slow, steady drum, picked up its rhythm. He watched her face as she worked, her expression one of deep concentration, her long lashes brushed against her cheeks. In that moment, she was not a frightened girl, but a capable woman. When she had cleaned the wound, she looked up, and for the first time her eyes met his and held. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. He saw his own reflection in the dark pools of her eyes, a scarred, lonely man being cared for with a tenderness he hadn't known in years. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then she broke the gaze, her cheeks flushing slightly. She released his hand and stepped back, retreating to the safety of her chair by the fire. But the connection had been made. A current had passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of something new and powerful growing in the space they shared. Later that week, a storm rolled in from the north, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed against the small cabin. The world outside was a maelstrom of noise and chaos. Inside, the fire crackled, a small bastion of warmth and light against the raging darkness. The storm seemed to agitate Elara. She paced the small cabin, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide and haunted. Silas watched her, recognizing the signs of a trauma being reawakened. The violence of the storm was echoing a violence from her past. He saw her flinch at a particularly loud clap of thunder, a small, choked sob escaping her. He put down the piece of wood he was carving and stood up. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. "It's just the wind, Elara," he said softly. "He can't get in, the walls are strong." She shook her head, her eyes squeezed shut. "He was like the storm," she whispered, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to him, loud and angry. And he would break things. The confession hung in the air, a raw, painful revelation. He understood now. The man in the locket, her husband, was a man of violence. His anger was the storm she was still weathering. A cold fury settled in Silas's gut. He wanted to hunt the man down, to make him pay for the fear he had etched into this woman's soul. But he knew that was not what she needed. She did not need another man's violence, even on her behalf. She needed safety. She needed peace. He didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. He simply stood there, a solid, unmovable presence. "He is not here," Silas said, his voice firm, a rock against the howling wind. "And he will not get in." He stayed there, a silent guardian, until the storm within her began to subside, her trembling slowly ceasing. The storm outside raged on through the night, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of peace began to take root, a quiet strength forged in a shared moment of vulnerability. In that moment, Silas realized his life was no longer his own. It was tied to hers, to her healing, to her safety. And in that realization, he did not feel burdened. He felt a purpose, a reason to keep the fire lit against the encroaching darkness. After the storm, both the one outside and the one inside Lara, a fragile calm settled over the homestead. The plains steamed under the morning sun. The air washed clean. Lara seemed to have shed another layer of her fear. As if by speaking of her husband, she had robbed him of some of his power over her. She began to venture outside the cabin for longer periods, exploring the immediate surroundings with a tentative curiosity. Silas watched her from a distance as she knelt by the small creek, her fingers trailing in the cool water, or as she stood by the corral watching the horses with a quiet appreciation. He noticed she had a way with animals. Ghost, who was usually wary of strangers, would allow her to approach, nuzzling her hand gently. It was as if the animals could sense the kindness in her, the part of her that had not been broken. One afternoon he found her in the small, neglected patch of ground behind the cabin where his wife had once tried to grow a garden. The soil was hard and unforgiving, but a few stubborn herbs had survived. Lara was on her knees, her hands in the dirt, carefully tending to a small mint plant. Her face was smudged with soil, and there was a look of quiet concentration in her eyes. It was the most peaceful he had ever seen her. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "My wife, Mary, she tried to make things grow here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "She said the land was too stubborn." Lara looked up at him, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the woman she might have been, the woman she could still become. "Everything just needs the right kind of care," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The simple words struck him with a surprising force. He looked from her to the small patch of green, and he understood she wasn't just talking about the garden. She was talking about him, about herself, about the fragile life they were building together in this desolate place. A seed of an idea took root in his mind. The next day he rode to the small, dusty settlement that was the closest thing to a town. A journey that took the better part of a day. It was a place he avoided, a place of noise and crowds and prying eyes. But he went anyway. He returned just after dusk, his saddlebags laden. He found Lara by the fire, reading her book of poetry. He dropped the heavy sacks on the table. She looked up, her eyes questioning. He opened one of the sacks. Inside were seeds, corn, beans, squash. In another there were small, sturdy tools, a trowel, a hand rake. "For the garden," he said, avoiding her gaze, feeling strangely shy. "If you want them." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and began to unsaddle Ghost, his heart pounding in his chest. When he returned to the cabin, Lara was standing by the table, her hand resting on the sack of seeds. There were tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were something else entirely. She looked at him, and the smile she gave him this time was not hesitant. It was full and bright, a sunrise after a long night. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. The sound of his own name on her lips was a strange and beautiful thing. In that moment he felt the hard, scarred ground of his own heart begin to soften, as if, after a long drought, it was finally beginning to rain. The garden became their shared project, a testament to their unspoken partnership. They worked side by side, turning the stubborn soil, clearing the rocks, and planting the seeds. Silas, with his brute strength, broke the hard-packed earth, while Lara, with her gentle hands, nurtured the tender shoots. They rarely spoke, but their movements were a conversation, a dance of shared purpose. The silence between them was now comfortable, filled with the rustle of leaves, the buzz of insects, and the soft thud of the hoe. The work transformed Lara. The sun turned her pale skin golden, and the physical labor put muscle on her thin frame. The haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a look of focused determination. She was no longer a ghost. She was a woman of the earth, her hands stained with the dirt that was giving them life. Silas found himself changing as well. The hard edges of his solitude were being worn away. He found himself smiling more, a strange, rusty feeling in the muscles of his face. He would watch Lara in the garden, her dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth. A smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a feeling of profound contentment would settle over him. It was a dangerous feeling, this quiet happiness. It was a thing to be cherished, but also a thing that could be lost. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their burgeoning garden, Hilara turned to him. "You will come looking for me," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. The statement hung in the air, a cold premonition. Silas had known this, of course. A man like the one she had described, a man of pride and cruelty, would not simply let his property go. "His name is Alistair Thorne," she continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "His family is wealthy, powerful. They believe the world belongs to them." Silas said nothing, his hand resting on the worn handle of the knife at his belt. He watched the last sliver of the sun disappear, plunging the plains into a deep purple twilight. "This is your home now," he said, his voice a low growl. "He has no claim here." "You don't understand, Silas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He is not a man who accepts no. He will see my leaving as a stain on his honor. He will not want me back. He will want to punish me, to make an example of me." A cold dread settled in Silas's stomach. He had fought nature. He had fought his own demons. But the thought of fighting a rich, powerful man with the law on his side was a different kind of battle. It was a battle he could not win with brute force alone. He looked at Hilara, at the fear that had crept back into her eyes, and a fierce, protective anger rose in him. He had let his guard down. He had allowed this fragile peace to feel permanent. He had forgotten that in this world nothing was given, everything had to be fought for. He reached out and for the first time took her hand. Her fingers were cool and trembled slightly in his rough, warm grasp. "Them come," Silas said, his voice hard as granite. The scar on his face was a livid line in the fading light. "He will find more than a frightened girl and a stubborn garden. He will find me." Hilara looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, at the grim determination in his eyes. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgment of the storm that was coming, and a silent promise that this time they would face it together. The peace was shattered a week later. Silas was returning from checking his perimeter, a routine he had become more diligent about since Hilara's warning. As he topped a low ridge overlooking his homestead, he saw it. A lone rider sitting on a fine black horse watching the cabin. The man was dressed in dark, expensive clothes, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. Even from a distance, Silas could see the glint of a silver-handled pistol at his hip. It was not Alistair Thorne. This man was a scout, a hunter, a wolf testing the air before the pack moved in. Silas's blood ran cold. He urged Ghost into a small ravine, dismounting and creeping back up to the ridge on foot, his rifle in his hand. He watched the man for a long time. The rider did not approach the cabin. He just sat there, patient and still, his gaze fixed on the small curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He was taking measure, assessing the layout of the land, noting the lack of other ranch hands, the isolation. He was noting its vulnerability. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned his horse and rode away, back to the east, disappearing over the horizon. Silas remained where he was, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. The threat was no longer a premonition. It had a face, a horse, a direction. He returned to the cabin, his movements tight with a controlled anger. Hilara was inside, kneading dough for the evening's bread. She looked up as he entered, and the fragile peace on her face dissolved as she saw the look on his. "What is it?" she asked, her hands stilling in the dough. "A rider," he said, his voice flat, watching the cabin. The color drained from her face. She knew, as he did, what it meant. The hunt had begun. That night, a new tension settled over them. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a hypervigilance. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every cry of a distant coyote was a potential threat. Silas did not sleep. He sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the moonlit plains. Hilara sat by the fire, her book of poetry lying unopened in her lap, her hands clutching the silver locket. "Tell me about him," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He needed to know his enemy. He needed to understand the monster they were facing. Ilara took a deep, shuddering breath. "My father was a merchant," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He fell on hard times. Alistair's family was an opportunity. They offered to clear my father's debts in exchange for a marriage contract." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. "I was a commodity, a piece of property to be traded. Alistair never saw me as anything more than that. He was handsome, charming to the world, but in private, he was cold, cruel. He enjoyed power. He enjoyed seeing things break." Silas's hand tightened on his rifle. "When he learned I could not bear children," she continued, her voice cracking, "his cruelty found a focus. He said I was flawed, a broken vessel. He shamed me in front of his family, in front of the servants. He locked me in my room for days at a time. He said if I could not be a wife, I would be a lesson." "So you ran," Silas finished for her. "I had a friend," she said, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "A maid. She helped me. She gave me her savings, a horse. She told me to ride west, to lose myself where no one would look for a lady. I rode until the horse gave out. Then I walked until—" her voice trailed off. "Until he had found her, a broken thing in the dust." He now understood the depth of her fear, the reason for her silence. She was not just fleeing a man, she was fleeing a world that had tried to erase her. "You are not broken, Ilara," he said, his voice fierce, "and you are not his to claim." He stood up and walked over to her. He knelt in front of her chair, taking her cold hands in his. "This is your land now. This is your home, and I will burn it to the ground before I let him take you from it." She looked into his eyes, into the fiery resolve she saw there, and for the first time since the rider had appeared on the ridge, she felt a flicker of hope. They were not two broken people waiting for a storm. They were a fortress, and they would not fall easily. The waiting was a unique form of torture. The days were long and filled with a silent, simmering tension. Every sunrise felt like a reprieve, every sunset a harbinger of danger. They worked in the garden, their movements sharp with nervous energy, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The vibrant green of the growing plants felt like an act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Silas taught Ilara how to shoot. He started with the rifle, showing her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. At first, the weapon was awkward in her hands, a brutal tool of a world she had never known. But she was a quick study. She listened to his instructions, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she fired the first shot, the kick of the rifle sent her stumbling back, her eyes wide with shock. But she did not drop the gun. She set her jaw, braced herself, and fired again. Her aim was unsteady, but there was a fierce determination in her that impressed him. "You aim for the heart," he told her, his voice low and grim. "You don't shoot to wound, you shoot to stop the threat, for good." The words were harsh, but she nodded, understanding the brutal calculus of survival in this land. It was not a game. It was life and death. One afternoon, as they were cleaning their weapons by the fire, Ilara looked at the intricate network of scars on Silas's arms, the angry, puckered flesh a stark contrast to the healthy skin. "Does it still hurt?" she asked softly. He paused, looking down at his arms as if seeing them for the first time. "No," he said, after a moment. "The fire's long out, but sometimes I still feel the heat." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "The worst scars are the ones you can't see, Ilara, the ones that burn on the inside." She knew what he meant. She carried her own invisible scars, the burns of shame and fear left by Alistair. "Perhaps," she said, her voice a quiet whisper, "some scars are not meant to heal. Perhaps they are meant to remind us that we survived." He looked at her, a sense of wonder filling him. She had a wisdom that belied her years, a strength forged in the crucible of her suffering. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found in the dust. She was his partner, his equal. The confrontation came 3 days later. They arrived at dawn, 3 of them. They did not ride to the cabin directly, but fanned out, taking positions on the low ridges surrounding the homestead. Silas had been expecting them. He had been sleeping in shifts, his senses on high alert. He saw their dark shapes against the graying sky, and his heart settled into a cold, hard rhythm. He woke Alara with a gentle shake. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. She was instantly awake, the fear in her eyes, but it was tempered with resolve. She dressed quickly and picked up the rifle, her movements sure and steady. There was no panic. They had prepared for this. The leader rode forward alone, a large, bull-necked man with a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to his vest. He stopped 100 yards from the cabin, his hand resting casually on his hip, near his pistol. "Silas!" the man shouted, his voice booming in the morning stillness. "I'm Sheriff Miller from Westgate County. I have a warrant for a runaway. A woman named Alara Thorne, her husband, has filed a complaint." Silas stepped out onto the porch, his own rifle held loosely in one hand. Alara remained inside, positioned at the window, out of sight. "I never heard of her," Silas called back, his voice flat. "This is my land. There's no one here but me." The sheriff chuckled, a humorless sound. "Don't play games with me, Silas. We saw her, a woman, in the garden. We know she's in there. Send her out and there won't be any trouble." "The only trouble here, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice dropping, "is you trespassing on my property." The sheriff's face hardened. "That woman is the property of Alistair Thorne. He wants her back, and what Mr. Thorne wants he gets. Now, you have two options. You can send her out, and I'll ride away, or we can come in and get her. And I can't guarantee you'll be standing when we leave." Silas raised his rifle, the movement slow and deliberate, and sighted on the sheriff's chest. "And you have one option, Sheriff," he said, his voice cold as the grave. "You can turn your horse around and ride off my land, or you can die on it." "The choice is yours." The air grew thick and heavy, the moment stretching into an eternity. The sheriff stared down the barrel of Silas's rifle, his bravado faltering. He could see the absolute conviction in Silas's eyes, the look of a man with nothing left to lose. A man who had already died once and was not afraid to do it again. Behind the sheriff, the other two men shifted uneasily on their horses, their own rifles now raised. From the window of the cabin, the sun glinted off the barrel of a second rifle. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. He had underestimated the situation. He had expected a simple farmer, not a fortress. He held up a hand, a gesture of placation. "All right, Silas," he said, his voice strained. "All right, we'll leave, for now." He spat on the ground, his face a mask of frustrated rage. "But this ain't over. Alistair Thorne is not a man to be trifled with. He will be back, and he'll bring more than 3 men. The sheriff wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following close behind, their retreat a cloud of dust and impotent fury. Silas remained on the porch, his rifle trained on them until they were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew the sheriff was right. This was not the end. It was just the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. The departure of the sheriff and his men did not bring relief, only a temporary stay of execution. The air on the homestead grew heavier, charged with the certainty of Alistair's arrival. The vast open plains no longer felt like a sanctuary of solitude, but a vulnerable, exposed stage upon which the final act of their drama would play out. Silas and Alara moved through their days with a grim purpose, their bond forged tighter in the crucible of shared danger. They spoke little of the coming threat, but it was a constant unspoken presence in their every action. Every bucket of water pulled from the well, every row of vegetables harvested from the garden, felt precious, a moment of normal life stolen from the jaws of impending violence. Silas worked tirelessly, fortifying the cabin. He reinforced the door, boarded up the smaller back window, and created firing positions from which they could defend their small fortress. He was a man preparing for a siege, his movements precise and economical, his face a mask of cold determination. Alara, in turn, prepared in her own way. She stockpiled food and water. She rolled cartridges for the rifles, her fingers, once accustomed to embroidery, now adept at handling lead and powder. The woman who had once been terrified of a raised voice was now preparing for war. The transformation was astonishing. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of tempered steel. She had found something worth fighting for, not just her own life, but the life they had built together, this fragile, beautiful thing that had grown in the most inhospitable soils. One evening, as they sat cleaning their rifles, a task that had become a nightly ritual, Alara turned to Silas, her face pale in the lantern light. "Silas," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper, "there is something I must ask of you." He looked at her, his hands stilling. "If I do not survive this," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "I want you to promise me something." "You will survive," he said, his voice a low growl. "We both will." "Promise me," she insisted, her voice gaining a note of urgency. "Promise me you will not let him take my body. Do not let him bury me in his cold, hard ground. Burn me, let my ashes scatter on the wind of these plains. Let me be free, at least in death." The request was a punch to the gut. He looked at her, at the fierce pride in her eyes, and he understood. It was not a plea of despair, but a final act of defiance, a refusal to be possessed, even as a corpse. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his rough fingers enclosing hers. "I promise, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "But it will not come to that. I will not let it." He squeezed her hand, a silent vow passing between them. In that moment, he was not just her protector. He was the guardian of her soul, the keeper of her freedom. It was a burden and an honor, a weight that settled deep in his bones and gave him a strength he had never known. Alistair Thorne arrived a week later, at the head of a small army. There were 10 of them, hard-faced men with rifles and cold eyes, mercenaries bought and paid for by Thorne's gold. They did not try to hide their approach, but rode openly across the plains, a dark, menacing tide flowing toward the small, isolated cabin. They surrounded the homestead, their numbers an overwhelming show of force. At their center was Alistair himself, mounted on a magnificent white stallion, a stark contrast to the dust and grit of his hired guns. He was exactly as Alara had described him, handsome, impeccably dressed, with an air of arrogant authority. He rode forward, stopping just out of rifle range, his lips curled in a condescending smirk. "Alara, my dear," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable note of menace. "Your little game of hide-and-seek is over. Come out, and I may yet be merciful. I have come to take you home." The cabin remained silent. Silas and Lara were inside, positioned at their respective windows, rifles at the ready. Silas's heart was a cold, steady hammer in his chest. "I know you are in there, you pathetic creature," Alistair sneered, his voice losing some of its polish. "And I know you have that scarred brute with you. Do you think he can protect you from me? I own this land. I own the law. I own you." From beside him, Silas heard a soft click as Alara cocked her rifle. He glanced at her. Her face was a mask of pale resolve. She was trembling, but her hands on the rifle were steady. The door to the cabin creaked open and Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held at his side. He stood there, a solitary, defiant figure against the backdrop of his home. "She is not your property," Silas called out, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And this is not your land. Turn around and leave. Now." Alistair laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "And who are you to tell me what to do? A broken-down farmer with a ruined face? I will have my wife, and I will burn this hovel to the ground with you inside it." He turned to his men. "Get her," he commanded. The men spurred their horses forward, their rifles raised. The air erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Silas fired, the report of his rifle echoing across the plains. One of the riders cried out and fell from his horse. From the window, Alara fired, her shot going wide but forcing the other riders to scatter for cover. The battle had begun. It was a desperate, uneven fight. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and thick. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Silas was a methodical, deadly shot, his movements calm and efficient. He fired, reloaded, and fired again, his face a grim mask. He was not just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the life they had built, for the woman who had brought light back into his darkness. He saw Ilara at the window, her face smudged with gunpowder, her eyes blazing with a fierce light. She was no longer a victim, she was a warrior, defending her home, defending her freedom. A bullet grazed Silas's arm, a hot, searing pain. He stumbled back, but did not fall. He leaned against the doorframe, raised his rifle, and took down another of Alistair's men. But there were too many of them. They were closing in, using the barn and the corrals for cover. Alistair, who had remained in the background, now rode forward, his own pistol drawn. He was aiming not at Silas, but at the window where Ilara was positioned. "It's over, Ilara!" he screamed, his face twisted with rage. "You are mine." Just as he was about to fire, the cabin door flew open, and Ilara stepped out, her own rifle raised. She stood beside Silas, a small, defiant figure against the chaos. "I am not yours," she cried, her voice ringing out across the battlefield, clear and strong. "I am not a thing to be owned. I am free." Alistair stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. This was not the timid, broken creature he had tormented. This was a stranger, a woman he did not recognize. His hesitation was his undoing. Silas fired, his bullet striking Alistair's pistol, sending it spinning from his hand. At the same time, Ilara fired. Her shot was true. Alistair cried out, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his fine white shirt. The fight went out of him. His men, seeing their leader wounded and their numbers dwindling, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, a disorganized retreat across the plains, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Alistair, his face a mask of pain and humiliation, glared at Ilara and Silas, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. "This is not over," he hissed, before wheeling his wounded horse around and galloping after his men. Silas and Ilara stood on the porch, their rifles still hot, watching until the last of the riders had disappeared over the horizon. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the groans of a wounded man near the barn. The battle was over. They had won. They had survived. Silas turned to Ilara. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes were shining with a triumphant light. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. In that moment, amidst the smoke and the blood and the wreckage of their home, they were not just survivors. They were victors. And the future, which had been a dark, threatening cloud, now held the first faint glimmer of a sunrise. The aftermath of the battle was a grim, silent affair. The sun rose higher, casting a harsh light on the scene of violence. The bodies of the fallen men lay where they had dropped, stark reminders of the price of their freedom. The wounded man by the barn had fallen silent. Silas felt a weariness seep into his bones, a weight heavier than any physical exhaustion. He had taken lives to protect his own, to protect Ilara's. It was a necessary evil, but the weight of it settled on his soul nonetheless. Ilara moved with a quiet, somber grace. She brought him a basin of water and a clean cloth, her hands gentle as she tended to the bullet graze on his arm. Her touch was a balm, not just to his wounded flesh, but to his bruised spirit. There were no words of victory, no celebrations. They had defended their home, but the violence had left its own scars, a fresh layer of trauma on top of the old ones. They worked together, clearing the evidence of the fight, their movements synchronized in a shared, unspoken understanding. They buried the dead in a shallow grave far from the cabin, a simple, unmarked plot on the vast, indifferent plains. It was a grim task, but they did it with a quiet dignity, a respect for the lives that had been lost, even if they were the lives of their enemies. In the days that followed, a profound quiet settled over the homestead. It was not the tense, watchful quiet of before, but a deep, peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a great storm has passed. The threat of Alistair Thorne was gone. They both knew he would not be back. His power was in his pride and his reputation, and they had shattered both. He was a man who would lick his wounds in private, not risk another public humiliation. The healing began, slowly, tentatively. The log walls of the cabin bore the scars of the battle, the bullet holes like dark, unblinking eyes. Silas did not repair them immediately. He left them as a reminder of what they had endured, of what they had overcome together. The garden, which had been trampled in the fight, became their focus. They worked to restore it, their hands in the earth coaxing life back from the brink of destruction. It was a therapeutic act, a way of reclaiming their peace, of replanting their hope. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the fields, Silas turned to Alara. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had been carving for days, a small, intricate songbird, fashioned from a piece of soft pine. He held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's for you," he said, his voice a low rumble, "to remind you that you have a voice, that you have a song, and that I will always be here to listen to it." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of deep, profound gratitude, of shared survival, of a love that had been forged in fire and silence. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and gunpowder, of tears and hope. It was the kiss of two broken souls who had found a way to make each other whole. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his scarred hand resting on the small of her back. Her head found its place in the hollow of his shoulder. They sat there for a long time, two quiet figures in the vast, enveloping darkness, their hearts beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The war was over. The long journey across the plains had ended. They were home. The seasons turned, the relentless cycle of the plains paying no mind to the small human drama that had played out on its stage. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The bullet holes in the cabin walls were eventually patched, the memory of the battle fading from a raw wound to a silvery scar. The garden flourished, a riot of color and life, a testament to Alara's patient care. The love between Silas and Alara blossomed in the same quiet, steady way. It was a love that did not need grand declarations or flowery words. It lived in the shared silence of the evenings, in the way he would watch her as she worked in the garden, in the way she would place a hand on his shoulder as she passed his chair. It was in the small, everyday acts of care and companionship. They were two halves of a whole, their broken pieces fitting together to create something strong and beautiful. Silas, the man who had walled himself off from the world, found his fortress of solitude transformed into a sanctuary of shared peace. Alara, the woman who had lost her voice, found it again, not in loud pronouncements, but in the quiet confidence of a person who is loved and valued for who she is. One crisp autumn morning, Alara woke with a sudden wave of nausea. Silas, ever attuned to her, noticed the new pallor of her skin, the slight tremor in her hands. He watched her with a quiet concern, his heart a tight knot of worry. A week later, when the morning sickness returned with a vengeance, a slow, dawning realization spread across Alara's face, a look of such profound shock and wonder that it took Silas's breath away. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a joy so fierce it was almost painful. "Silas," she whispered, her hand resting on her flat stomach. I think I am with child." The words hung in the air, a stunning, impossible revelation. Alara, the woman who had been shamed and cast out for being barren, was carrying a new life. It was a miracle, a final, defiant answer to the cruelty of her past. Silas stared at her, his mind reeling. A child, his child, a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him, washed through him. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine, a future filled with the sound of a child's laughter, a future where the ghosts of his past were finally truly laid to rest. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt before her, his hands gently framing her face. He looked deep into her eyes, and he saw not just the woman he loved, but the mother of his child. He saw their future. He pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as he absorbed the enormity of the moment. "Blara," he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You are not a broken vessel. You are the source of all my hope. You are my life." That winter, as the first snows began to dust the plains, Silas added a new room to the cabin, a small nursery with a window that faced the rising sun. He worked with a joyful purpose. the sound of his hammer, and saw a happy rhythm in the crisp winter air. Ilara sat by the fire, her body growing round with the new life inside her, her hands busy knitting a tiny blanket from soft wool. The silver locket lay on the mantelpiece, its clasp closed, its power to cause pain finally gone. It was just a piece of metal now, a relic from a past that no longer had any hold on her. Their son was born in the spring as the plains were exploding with the vibrant green of new life. He was a healthy, robust baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady gray eyes. They named him Caleb, a name that meant faithful and wholehearted. Silas would hold his son in his arms, his large, scarred hands looking impossibly gentle against the baby's tiny form, and a feeling of such profound love would fill him that it felt as if his heart would burst. He would look at Ilara, who was watching them with a smile that lit up her whole face, and he would know, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was the luckiest man on earth. The scarred cowboy and the orphan bride had not just survived, they had triumphed. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built a family. They had found love in the most desolate of places, and they had made the desert bloom. Their story was not one that would be written in history books. It was a small, quiet story, a whisper on the vast, unending plains. But it was a story of hope, of redemption, and of the enduring power of a love that was strong enough to heal all wounds, to conquer all fears, and to build a home in the heart of the wilderness. And as they sat on the porch of their small cabin, their son sleeping peacefully between them, they watched the sun set on their kingdom of peace, their hearts full, their future as wide and as promising as the endless sky above.